Number 1, Terry Rasmussen. If there is a case that defines the concept of a ghost story in the annals of true crime, a case that haunted an entire state not for years, but for decades, it is the mystery of the barrels in Bear Brook State Park. For a generation of detectives in New Hampshire, it was the case that couldn't be solved, a puzzle with missing pieces that spanned across the entire American continent. At the center of this darkness stands a man who was not just a killer, but a shapeshifter, a predator who shed identities like snake skin, leaving a trail of dead women and children in his wake. To the world of forensic science, he is a revolutionary figure, the first serial killer ever identified solely through genetic genealogy. But to the terrified families he destroyed, he is simply the Chameleon. His name was Terry Rasmussen, and his crimes are widely considered the most disturbing in the history of New Hampshire. The nightmare began on a crisp autumn afternoon, November 10, 1985, in the dense, silent woods of Allenstown. A local hunter was moving through the brush near the site of a burned-down general store when he stumbled upon something that didn't belong. It was a 55-gallon industrial steel drum, rusted and overturned, lying amidst the fallen leaves like a piece of forgotten trash. It wasn't uncommon to find garbage in these woods, but something about this barrel felt wrong. When the hunter looked inside, the smell of death hit him before the sight did. Wrapped in heavy industrial plastic and electrical wire were the decomposing remains of a woman and a young girl. The discovery sent a shockwave through the small community. Who were they? No one had reported them missing. The police scoured missing persons reports from across New England, but came up empty. They were Jane Doe's, ghosts in a metal tomb. The case went cold almost immediately, a grim question mark that hung over the state police barracks for 15 years. Then, the impossible happened. In 2000, a new generation of investigators decided to revisit the cold case. They returned to the woods of Bear Brook, hoping to find a clue that had been missed in 1985. They didn't find a clue, they found a second nightmare. Just 100 yards away from where the first barrel had been discovered, hidden deep in the undergrowth, they found another 55-gallon drum. Inside were the remains of 2 more little girls. The revelation was shattering. This wasn't just a murder, it was a massacre. A woman and 3 children, bludgeoned to death, dismembered, and discarded like waste in the same patch of forest. Forensic analysis suggested they had all been killed around the same time, likely between 1980 and 1984. For nearly 2 decades, families had hiked and camped in these woods, oblivious to the mass grave just off the trail. The victims remained nameless for 34 years, known only as the Allenstown Four. But while they lay in their unmarked graves, their killer was living a life of terrifying freedom, drifting across the country and reinventing himself at every stop. To understand the monster, we must travel back to Manchester, New Hampshire, in the late 1970s. A man calling himself Bob Evans worked as an electrician at the Wambach Mill. He was a scruffy, enigmatic drifter who charmed his way into the life of Marlies Honeychurch, a 24-year-old mother of 2 who had recently left her family in California after a petty argument. Marlies was vulnerable, and Evans was a predator who specialized in vulnerability. He isolated her. On Thanksgiving of 1978, Marlies brought Evans home to meet her family. It was a disaster. They argued, and Marlies stormed out with her 2 daughters, Marie and Sarah, and her new boyfriend. Her family never saw her again. They spent decades hiring private investigators, searching for Marlies, believing she had simply chosen to start a new life. They had no idea that she and her daughters had never left New Hampshire. They had been murdered by Evans, stuffed into barrels, and dumped in the woods near his workplace. But the horror of the Bear Brook case has a twist that makes it unique in the history of crime. DNA analysis revealed that the 3rd child found in the barrels, the middle child, who was not related to Marlies or her daughters, was actually the biological daughter of the killer himself. Terry Rasmussen had murdered his girlfriend, her 2 children, and his own flesh and blood. He wiped out an entire family unit, including his own progeny, and then simply walked away to start over. After the murders in New Hampshire, the man known as Bob Evans vanished. He resurfaced in California in 1981, now calling himself Curtis Kimball. He was living with another young girl, about 5 years old, whom he claimed was his daughter, Lisa. But Lisa wasn't his daughter. She was the daughter of another woman, Denise Bowden, whom Rasmussen had dated in New Hampshire after Marlies. Denise Bowden disappeared in 1981 and has never been found. Police presume she is buried somewhere between the east and west coasts. Rasmussen kept her daughter, using her as a prop to appear like a sympathetic single father. In 1985, he was arrested for drunk driving and child endangerment, and it was discovered he had abandoned Lisa at an RV park. He served a short stint in prison, then disappeared again, changing his name to Gordon Jensen. His final act of brutality came in 2002, in Richmond, California. Now an old man calling himself Larry Vanner, he was living with a chemist named Unsoon June. When Unsoon vanished, police searched Vanner's home. In the basement, buried under a mountain of cat litter to mask the smell of decomposition, they found her dismembered body. Rasmussen was arrested and sentenced to life in prison. He was arrogant and uncooperative, taking his secrets to the grave when he died of natural causes in prison in 2010. At the time of his death, authorities in California had no idea that their prisoner, Larry Vanner, was the same man as Bob Evans, the butcher of Bear Brook. It wasn't until 2016 that the threads finally came together. A relentless genetic genealogist named Dr. Barbara Ravender used the DNA of the abandoned girl, Lisa, to track down her relatives in New Hampshire. This connection blew the case wide open. It linked the man in the California prison to the missing Denise Bowden, and subsequently to the barrels in Allenstown. By comparing the DNA of the killer to the unidentified child in the barrel, his daughter, police confirmed that Bob Evans, Curtis Kimball, Gordon Jensen, and Larry Vanner were all one man, Terry Petter Rasmussen. Born in Colorado in 1943, he was a Navy veteran turned serial killer who used the vastness of America to hide his crimes. In 2019, nearly 40 years after they were murdered, Marlies Honeychurch and her daughters Marie and Sarah were finally given their names back. The identity of Rasmussen's own daughter in the barrel remains a matter of sensitivity, but she too has been identified by family. The Bear Brook murders stand as number one on our list because they represent the ultimate nightmare of the modern age, a killer who could be anyone, a chameleon, who lived among us, worked with us, and drank with us, all while hiding a trail of bodies that spanned the continent. Terry Rasmussen proved that in the quiet, granite woods of New Hampshire, evil can lie dormant for decades, waiting for science to finally catch up to its cruelty. Number 2, Sheila Labarre. If Terry Rasmussen was the ghost in the woods, a phantom who struck and vanished, Sheila Labarre was the monster in the castle. She did not hide in the shadows, she lived in the bright, open pastures of Epping, New Hampshire, on a sprawling 70-acre estate that she treated as her own sovereign kingdom. To the locals driving past the white fences of Red Oak Hill Road, she was known simply as the wealthy widow, an eccentric woman who rode expensive horses and claimed to see angels. But behind the gates of her farm, Sheila Labarre was constructing a reality that defied all laws of God and man. She was not just a killer, she was a warden, a torturer, and a self-proclaimed deity who believed she had the divine right to decide who lived and who burned. Her case stands as number 2 on our list because it shatters the comfort of the rural idyll, proving that the most terrifying house on the street isn't the dilapidated shack with broken windows, but the grand farmhouse where the owner smiles at you from the porch, all while human bones are smoldering in the fire pit in her backyard. To understand the magnitude of the horror that unfolded in Epping, one must first look at the woman who orchestrated it. Sheila Labarre was a figure of intense contradictions. Born in Alabama, she moved to New Hampshire and eventually married Wilfred "Bill" Labarre, a successful chiropractor. When Bill died in 2000 at the age of 74, he left Sheila everything: the massive farm, the horses, and a significant fortune. While his death was officially ruled natural, whispers in the community persisted for years. Neighbors found it strange how quickly Sheila moved on, how eagerly she took control of the estate. With Bill gone, Sheila's eccentricities began to curdle into something far more malignant. She began referring to herself as a princess. She told people she had connections to the CIA, that she could read minds, and that she received direct orders from God. She was a narcissist of the highest order, a woman who viewed other human beings not as equals, but as toys to be played with, broken, and discarded. Sheila's modus operandi was unique among female serial killers. She did not kill for insurance money, nor did she kill quickly. She hunted for companionship that she could consume. She targeted a specific demographic, young men who were drifting, vulnerable, or intellectually disabled. She looked for men who were starving for affection or a mother figure, men who would be dazzled by the promise of living on a wealthy estate with a woman who promised to take care of them. She enticed them with offers of work, motorcycles, and romance. But once they crossed the threshold of the farm, the fairy tale ended, and the nightmare began. The true scope of her depravity came to light through the tragic story of Kenneth County. Kenny was 24 years old, a gentle, trusting young man with a childlike innocence and a reported IQ of around 69. He was the perfect victim for a predator like Sheila. He met her through a personal ad, and she swept him off his feet with promises of a better life. In 2006, Kenny moved into the farmhouse. At first, it seemed like a dream. But slowly, methodically, Sheila began to dismantle his identity. She took his cell phone. She isolated him from his family. The girlfriend became the master. Neighbors began to notice a shocking deterioration in Kenny's appearance. The once healthy young man was becoming a skeleton. He was seen working in the fields from dawn until dusk, looking gaunt, terrified, and covered in bruises. On the rare occasions he was seen in town with Sheila, he kept his head down, afraid to speak, casting fearful glances at the woman who controlled his every breath. Inside the farmhouse, Kenny was living in a domestic hell that rivals the worst torture scenarios in criminal history. Sheila did not just abuse him, she enslaved him. Evidence later revealed that she withheld food from him as punishment. She beat him with household objects. In a detail that sickened the jury, it was revealed that she scalded him with boiling water, pouring it over his body when he failed to meet her impossible standards. She treated him like a disobedient dog, eroding his will to live until he was nothing more than a vessel for her sadism. Kenny County was not just a victim of murder, he was a victim of a slow, agonizing erasure. But Kenny was not the only ghost on the farm. Before him, there was Michael DeLog. Michael was a 38-year-old drifter who had moved in with Sheila in 2005. Like Kenny, he was vulnerable. And like Kenny, he simply vanished. When Michael's family inquired about his whereabouts, Sheila spun a web of lies. She told them he had gone to rehab, or that he had run off with another woman, or that he was working out of state. Because Michael lived a transient lifestyle, the lies were accepted. But Michael had never left the farm. He had been murdered, his body destroyed in the very fire pit that Kenny County was forced to tend. The cruelty of the timeline is staggering. Kenny County was likely living in the house, being tortured, while the remains of his predecessor were scattered in the soil just yards away. The unraveling of Sheila Labarre's kingdom began on Easter weekend in April 2006. Kenny County's mother, who had been trying desperately to maintain contact with her son, grew frantic when he failed to call her. A mother's intuition told her that the silence was not voluntary. She called the Epping Police Department and requested a welfare check. This phone call would be the catalyst that exposed one of the most gruesome crime scenes in New England history. When the police officers arrived at the farm on Red Oak Hill Road, they were met with a scene that felt wrong on a primal level. The estate was quiet, too quiet. Sheila Labarre met them at the door. She was agitated, her eyes wild, her story shifting with every sentence. When asked about Kenny, she claimed he wasn't there. She spat out insults, calling him a pedophile and a deviant whom she had kicked out. She pointed to the driveway and said he had walked away. But the officers were observant. They noticed that Kenny's meager belongings were still in the house. They noticed Sheila's erratic, defensive behavior. And as they walked the property, the wind shifted. It was the smell that gave her away. Drifting from the backyard was the thick, acrid stench of burning biological matter. It wasn't the smell of burning leaves or trash, it was the sweet, sickly scent of death. The officers noticed a large burn pit behind the house, a mound of ash and debris that was still smoldering. They also noticed that the soil around the septic tank had been recently disturbed. The instinct of the officers kicked in. They knew this was no longer a welfare check, it was a homicide investigation. They returned with a search warrant, and the excavation of the Labarre farm began. It was a process that traumatized the investigators involved. As forensic teams sifted through the ashes of the burn pit, they began to find fragments. They weren't just logs, they were bones. Thousands of tiny, calcified bone fragments were recovered, remnants of bodies that had been burned at extremely high temperatures over a long period. But the most macabre discovery came from the septic tank. When investigators opened it, they found human tissue that had not been fully destroyed. Floating in the waste were human toes. The forensic anthropologists had the grim task of piecing together the puzzle. Through DNA analysis, they confirmed the identities of the remains. The bones in the pit and the tissue in the tank belonged to Michael DeLogg in Kenneth County. The horrifying truth was laid bare: Sheila Labarre had been slaughtering her lovers, dismembering them, and burning them in her backyard, likely forcing her current victim to help dispose of the previous one. Sheila was arrested, but her capture was not the end of the drama, it was the beginning of a surreal legal spectacle. From the moment she was in handcuffs, Sheila Labarre did not behave like a criminal trying to hide her guilt. She behaved like a martyr. She claimed that she was an avenging angel, sent by God to cleanse the world of evil men. She readily admitted to the killings but refused to call them murders. In her twisted narrative, she was the hero. She told psychiatrists and detectives that Kenny County and Michael DeLogg were pedophiles, a claim for which there was absolutely zero evidence, and that by killing them, she was protecting children. She described the act of shooting Kenny County not with remorse, but with a chilling sense of duty, claiming she sent him to a higher place. The trial, which took place in 2008, captivated and horrified the nation. It became a battleground of psychiatry. The defense team, facing insurmountable physical evidence, had only one card to play: the insanity defense. They argued that Sheila Labarre was profoundly mentally ill, suffering from severe psychosis and delusional disorder. They painted a portrait of a woman who had broken from reality, a woman who truly believed she was receiving orders from the divine. They delved into her past, alleging a history of childhood abuse that had fractured her psyche. They brought in experts to testify that she could not distinguish right from wrong because, in her mind, she was following the laws of God, not the laws of New Hampshire. The prosecution, however, presented a much darker, more calculated picture. They argued that Sheila Labarre was not crazy, she was evil. They pointed to the meticulous planning of her crimes. She didn't kill in a frenzy of hallucinations, she lured these men carefully. She isolated them. She took control of their finances. She bought specific supplies, tote bags, cleaning chemicals, ammunition, weeks in advance. They used surveillance footage from local stores showing a calm, composed Sheila buying the tools she would use to dispose of the bodies. They argued that her angel persona was a convenient mask, a facade she adopted to justify her sadistic urges. The prosecutor labeled her a psychopath, a narcissist who enjoyed the power of life and death. The most heart-wrenching testimony came from the details of the suffering. The jury listened in stunned silence as the medical examiner described the condition of the remains. They heard about the starvation. They heard about the scalding. They heard about the sheer duration of the abuse. It became clear that for Kenny County, death was likely a mercy release from the living hell of the farm. The prosecution argued that Sheila knew exactly what she was doing, she was hunting the weak to feed her own ego. In May of 2008, the jury delivered their verdict. They rejected the insanity plea. They saw through the performance of the mad princess. Sheila Labarre was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder. The courtroom erupted in relief, but Sheila remained defiant. At her sentencing, she rambled about her divine mission, showing not a flicker of regret for the lives she had stolen or the families she had destroyed. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Because New Hampshire does not have a maximum security facility for women capable of handling a prisoner of her profile, she was transferred to the MCI Framingham Prison in Massachusetts, where she remains to this day. The legacy of Sheila Labarre haunts the town of Epping. The farmhouse, once a symbol of rural wealth, became a symbol of depravity. The property was eventually sold, the house razed, the land trying to heal from the memories of the burn pit. But for the people of New Hampshire, the lesson remains. Sheila Labarre proved that a serial killer doesn't need to be a shadowy drifter. She proved that a serial killer can be the lady next door, the one with the horses and the large estate, the one who waves at you as you drive by, while the smoke from her backyard carries the ashes of the men who loved her. She stands as number 2 because her crime was a violation of the most basic human trust, the trust between two people living under the same roof, and because she turned the American dream of a farmhouse in the country into a slaughterhouse of the soul. Number 3, Robert Tulloch and James Parker. If the previous cases on this list were defined by madness or obsession, the case of Robert Tulloch and James Parker is defined by something far more chilling: boredom. We travel now to Hanover, New Hampshire, the intellectual crown jewel of the state. This is the home of Dartmouth College, an Ivy League institution nestled in the Upper Valley. It is a town of brick buildings, snow-covered greens, and a population of professors, doctors, and students. It is a bubble of safety and higher learning, a place where people leave their doors unlocked because the concept of violent crime feels alien, something that happens in cities, not in the quiet sanctuary of academia. But on January 27, 2001, that bubble was burst forever. It was not destroyed by a monster from the woods or a career criminal. It was destroyed by 2 high school students, the president of the student council and a band geek, who decided that killing 2 innocent people was simply the next logical step in their life plan. To understand the horror of the Dartmouth murders, you have to look into the minds of the perpetrators. Robert Tulloch, 17, and James Parker, 16, lived in the nearby town of Chelsea, Vermont, a sleepy community just across the river. To the outside world, they were the picture of wholesome American youth. Tulloch was brilliant, charismatic, and articulate. He was the student council president, a debater, and a leader among his peers. Parker was his best friend, a talented musician who played the bass in a band, a sensitive kid who came from a good family. There were no red flags. There was no history of abuse, no poverty, no gang involvement. They were the boys next door. But secretly, a toxic dynamic was festering between them. Robert Tulloch was not just smart, he was a narcissist of the highest order. He had adopted a twisted, Nietzschean philosophy. He believed that he was a superior being, an Übermensch, who was above the moral laws that governed ordinary people. He viewed empathy as a weakness and conscience as a defect. He had slowly, methodically groomed James Parker, turning the younger boy into his willing disciple. Tulloch convinced Parker that the world was boring, that their small-town lives were suffocating, and that they were destined for something greater. They fantasized about a new life, a life of adventure and freedom in Australia. They wanted to surf, to climb mountains, to live without rules. Most teenagers with such a dream would get a summer job, save up money, and buy a plane ticket. But Tulloch's mind didn't work that way. He didn't want to work, he wanted to take. He decided that they needed $10,000 to fund their escape to Australia. And he decided that the most efficient way to get that money was not to earn it, but to steal it. And because they were super criminals, in training, they decided that leaving witnesses was a mistake. Therefore, they had to kill. The chilling aspect of this case is the preparation. This was not a crime of passion, it was a crime of calculation. For months, Tulloch and Parker treated murder like a science project. They researched weapons online. They settled on the SOG Seal 2000, a high-end combat knife used by the Navy SEALs. They bought 2 of them over the internet, using Parker's credit card. They practiced their stealth. They desensitized themselves. They even dug a practice grave in the woods, though they would never use it. They also engaged in dry runs. In the summer and fall of 2000, they knocked on doors in wealthy neighborhoods, testing their ruse. They posed as students conducting an environmental survey. If the homeowner seemed suspicious or if the situation wasn't perfect, they would just ask their questions and leave. They were hunting for the perfect victims, wealthy, isolated, and trusting. They failed 4 times before they found the Xantops. 4 times, they walked up to a door with knives in their backpacks, ready to kill, but backed down at the last second. This detail is terrifying because it shows the persistence of their intent. They weren't discouraged by failure, they just refined their strategy. On the morning of Saturday, January 27, 2001, they drove Parker's silver Audi to the Etna section of Hanover. This was a neighborhood of expensive, secluded homes tucked away in the trees. They spotted a house with a Volvo in the driveway. It looked promising. It was the home of Half and Suzanne Xantop. Half Xantop, 62, was a beloved professor of earth sciences at Dartmouth. He was a geologist, a man who loved the natural world. Suzanne Xantop, 55, was the chair of the German Studies Department. They were German immigrants who had built a beautiful life in America. They were known for their hospitality, their intellect, and their kindness. They were the pillars of the Dartmouth community. When the doorbell rang that morning, Half Xantop answered. He saw 2 polite-looking teenagers. Tulloch, wearing his mask of charm, explained that they were students from the local high school conducting a survey for an environmental class. Half, being an educator and a kind man, invited them in. He called out to his wife, Suzanne, who was in the kitchen preparing a lunch for a dinner party they were hosting that night. The boys were led into the study. They sat down. Half Xantop sat at his desk. The boys asked a few questions about the environment. Then, the trap snapped shut. The violence was sudden, brutal, and overwhelmingly unfair. Tulloch and Parker pulled the SOG Seal 2000 knives from their backpacks. They attacked Half Xantop first. The professor fought back, but he was taken completely by surprise. He was stabbed repeatedly in the chest and neck. Hearing the commotion, Suzanne rushed into the study from the kitchen. She was met by the boys, who turned their fury on her. The scene in that study was a massacre. 2 brilliant minds were extinguished in a frenzy of blade strikes, all for a fantasy of surfing in Australia. But then, the masterminds panicked. The plan was to force the victims to give up their PIN numbers and credit cards before killing them. In the adrenaline and chaos of the attack, they forgot. Or perhaps Half and Suzanne fought too hard. Regardless, the boys were left standing over 2 dead bodies with absolutely nothing to show for it. No money. No credit cards. Just blood. They realized they had failed. They fled the house, leaving a trail of bloody footprints in the snow. But in their haste, they made a critical error. Robert Tulloch, the genius, the superior being, had accidentally dropped the sheath of his knife at the scene. They drove back to Chelsea, Vermont. They cleaned the blood off their clothes. They washed the knives. And then, they did something that chills the soul, they went back to their lives. They went to school on Monday. They attended band practice. They laughed with their friends. They acted as if nothing had happened. Meanwhile, in Hanover, the community was in a state of absolute terror. When a friend arrived at the Xantop house that evening for the dinner party, she found the bodies. The police arrived to find a scene of carnage. The brutality suggested a crime of passion, perhaps a revenge killing. The rumors flew wild. Was it a hate crime? Was it a disgruntled student? Was it a serial killer targeting academics? People in Hanover stopped walking their dogs at night. Hardware stores sold out of locks and security systems. The idea that 2 professors could be butchered in their own home in the middle of the day shattered the psyche of the town. The investigation was massive. The New Hampshire State Police, the FBI, and local authorities formed a task force. But for weeks, they had nothing. No motive. No suspects. Just a knife sheath and a boot print. The breakthrough came from the sheath. It was a rare brand. Investigators traced the serial number and the type. They found that a specific batch had been sold over the internet. They began to subpoena records from online knife retailers. And there, on a list of purchasers, was the name, James Parker, Chelsea, Vermont. It seemed impossible. A 16-year-old kid from a nice family. But the police went to the Parker home to interview him. They played it cool. They asked James if he had bought the knives. James, thinking quickly, lied. He said he had bought them, but he had sold them to a stranger at a surplus store. He tried to act helpful. But the police noticed something. The tires on his Audi looked like they might match the tracks found near the Xantop house. And James seemed nervous. Tulloch and Parker sensed the net tightening. The superior beings realized their game was up. They decided to run. They packed their bags, got into the Audi, and fled. They drove west, heading for California, perhaps hoping to catch a boat to Australia, still clinging to their delusional dream. The flight of the two teenagers turned the case into a national manhunt. The FBI tracked their credit card usage. They made it all the way to Newcastle, Indiana. There, at a truck stop, their journey ended. A police officer, alerting to the description of the car and the boys, approached them. They didn't go out in a blaze of glory. They surrendered quietly. The interrogation room was where the dynamic between the two boys finally fractured. Separated from Tulloch, James Parker crumbled. The follower could no longer sustain the lie. Confronted with the reality of what he had done, he broke down. He confessed to everything. He told the police about the plan, the Australia fantasy, the failed attempts, and the gruesome details of the murder. He painted a picture of Tulloch as the puppet master, the one who had engineered the entire tragedy. Robert Tulloch, however, remained in character to the bitter end. He was cold, arrogant, and detached. He showed no remorse. He didn't cry. He seemed more annoyed that his plan had failed due to bad luck than horrified by the lives he had taken. He tried to play mind games with the interrogators, but the evidence, Parker's confession, the DNA on the knives, the footprints, was overwhelming. The legal proceedings were swift but heavy with emotion. New Hampshire prosecutors made it clear, they were seeking the maximum penalty. Although they couldn't seek the death penalty because the boys were minors at the time of the crime, a legal nuance that would later be cemented by the Supreme Court, they sought life without parole. Robert Tulloch, realizing he had no escape, pleaded guilty to first-degree murder. In April 2002, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. At his sentencing, he stood stone-faced, offering no apology to the weeping daughters of Half and Suzanne Xantop. He remains incarcerated to this day, superior being living in a concrete cage. James Parker took a different path. He pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, testifying against Tulloch and expressing deep remorse. He was sentenced to 25 years to life. For 2 decades, the case seemed closed. But in 2024, a new chapter was written. James Parker, having served his minimum sentence of 25 years, was granted parole. The decision sparked a fierce debate in New Hampshire. On one side were those who believed in redemption, arguing that Parker was a manipulated child who had grown into a remorseful man, a model prisoner who had earned 2 degrees and created art behind bars. On the other side were those who believed that the brutality of the crime, the stabbing of 2 kind people in their own home, should forfeit the right to freedom forever. Regardless of the debate, James Parker walked free, leaving Tulloch as the sole prisoner of their dark pact. The Dartmouth murders stand as number 3 on our list because they represent a terrifying violation of the social contract. We expect crime to be driven by desperation, by poverty, by passion. We do not expect it to be driven by an intellectual exercise. Tulloch and Parker proved that intelligence is not a safeguard against evil, in fact, it can be a tool for it. They showed that beneath the veneer of the good student and the quiet neighbor, there can lurk an emptiness so profound that it views human life as nothing more than an obstacle to a vacation. The case changed New Hampshire. It ended the era of unlocked doors in the Upper Valley. It forced the community to look at their own children and wonder what was happening behind the closed doors of their bedrooms, in the glow of their computer screens. It shattered the Ivy League bubble, proving that no amount of education or prestige can build a wall high enough to keep out the darkness of the human heart. Number 4, Stephen Spader and Christopher Gribble. If the Dartmouth murders were a crime of cold, intellectual arrogance, the crime that struck the sleepy town of Mont Vernon 8 years later was a crime of chaotic, feral madness. We travel to the year 2009. Mont Vernon is a quintessential New England hamlet, a place of winding roads, colonial farmhouses, and a silence so profound you can hear the leaves falling in autumn. It is the kind of place people move to when they want to escape the noise of the world. But on the chill morning of October 4th, the silence was shattered by a scream that no one heard, inside a house that became the setting for one of the most savage home invasions in American history. Number 4 on our list is the story of the Mont Vernon thrill killers, Stephen Spader and Christopher Gribble. Their names have become synonymous with a new breed of evil, the disconnected, desensitized teenager who kills simply to see if he can feel something. To understand the carnage, we must look at the ringleader. Stephen Spader was 17 years old. He was a high school dropout, drifting through life in the nearby town of Brookline. To his parents, he was a troubled kid with a history of behavioral issues. But to his circle of friends, he was a dark messiah. Spader was obsessed with violence. He worshipped the movie Natural-Born Killers. He read books about the Zodiac Killer. He dressed in trench coats and spoke in grandiose terms about starting a revolution of chaos. He formed a loose gang of outcasts which he called the Disciples of Destruction, or DOD. It sounded like a bad role-playing game, a fantasy constructed by bored teenagers. But for Spader, the fantasy was bleeding into reality. He desperately wanted to earn his stripes. He wanted to be a real killer. His right-hand man was Christopher Gribble, 20 years old. Gribble was a different kind of monster. While Spader was manic and charismatic, Gribble was cold, detached, and unsettlingly articulate. He was a former Eagle Scout, a boy who had been raised in a religious home, but who harbored a deep, icy void inside him. He would later describe himself to psychiatrists not as a human being, but as a machine. He claimed he had no ability to feel empathy, that he could look at a dying person and feel the same emotion he felt looking at a piece of toast. Spader provided the fire, Gribble provided the ice. Together, they fed off each other's nihilism, creating a feedback loop that spiraled toward murder. The plan was hatched in the basement of Spader's home. It wasn't a robbery gone wrong, it was a home invasion mission, planned with the meticulousness of a military operation, but executed with the clumsiness of children. They recruited 2 other friends, William Marks and Quinn Glover. These 2 were the followers, the beta males who were too afraid to say no to Spader. The goal was simple: pick a random house in a remote location, break in, steal whatever they wanted, and kill every living thing inside. Spader made it clear, no witnesses. He wanted to see the life leave someone's eyes. They chose their target almost arbitrarily. They drove around the back roads of Mont Vernon until they saw a house on Trow Road. It was a beautiful, isolated colonial home surrounded by trees. It looked like the perfect place for a horror movie. It was the home of the Cates family. David Cates, an engineer, was away on a business trip. Inside the house were his wife, Kimberly Cates, a 42-year-old nurse beloved for her compassion, and their 11-year-old daughter, Jamie. On the night of October 4, 2009, the 4 boys parked their car down the road. They crept through the woods. Spader had armed himself with a weapon that would become the symbol of this tragedy, a machete. Gribble carried a dagger. Marks and Glover stood watch, their nerve already failing them, but too terrified of Spader to run. They cut the power to the house. They cut the phone lines. Then, they broke in through the basement door. The house was pitch black. Spader and Gribble, using the glow of an iPod for light, crept upstairs to the master bedroom. They found Kimberly Cates sleeping in the bed. Jamie, who had woken up scared, had come into her mother's room and was sleeping beside her. What happened next is a scene of savagery that traumatized the first responders. Spader didn't hesitate. He swung the machete. He attacked Kimberly Cates with a ferocity that defies description. There was no demand for money, no conversation. Just hacking. Kimberly, waking up to a nightmare, tried to shield her daughter with her own body. She took blow after blow, sacrificing herself in the dark to protect her child. Gribble joined in, stabbing with his knife. The violence was frenzied, loud, and chaotic. In the midst of the bloodbath, Jamie Cates was struck too. She was slashed across the face, the chest, and the limbs. Her foot was nearly severed. She was thrown against a glass door, shattering it. Believing both victims were dead, Spader and Gribble stopped. They were panting, covered in blood. They turned their attention to looting the house. But they didn't take diamonds or cash stashes. They stole trivial things. They took jewelry, an old camera, and a few electronics. It was a pathetic haul for such a high cost. But in the darkness of the bedroom, a miracle was happening. Jamie Cates was not dead. Despite her catastrophic injuries, despite seeing her mother murdered inches away from her, the 11-year-old girl possessed a survival instinct that is nothing short of supernatural. She realized that if she moved, they would come back. So, she played dead. She lay still in her own blood, controlling her breathing, while the monsters who killed her mother ransacked the room. Eventually, the boys left. They ran back to the car, high on adrenaline. Spader was reportedly ecstatic. He laughed. He bragged about the sound the machete made. He felt like a god. They drove to a diner in a nearby town and ate breakfast, still washing the specks of blood off their hands, joking about the mission. Back at the house on Trow Road, Jamie Cates waited until she was sure they were gone. Then, broken and bleeding, she crawled. She couldn't walk. She dragged herself to the kitchen phone. It didn't work, the lines were cut. But she remembered her father had a cell phone or a different line somewhere else. She managed to dial 911. The recording of that call is heartbreaking. A tiny, weak voice whispering that men had broken in and hurt her mommy. When the police and paramedics arrived, they found Kimberly Cates dead. But they found Jamie alive. She was rushed to the hospital in critical condition. She underwent multiple surgeries. She survived. And because she survived, she became the witness that would bring the DOD down. The investigation moved with lightning speed, not just because of Jamie's description, but because teenage killers rarely keep secrets. Stephen Spader couldn't help himself. He bragged. He told friends at school. He texted people hints about what he had done. He wanted the credit. One of the people he told went to the police. Within days, the 4 boys were arrested. The police found the stolen items. They found the machete. They found the text messages where they discussed the DOD and the murder plan using code words. The legal proceedings that followed were a study in 2 different types of evil. Stephen Spader loved the attention. In court, he didn't hide his face. He smiled. He winked at the cameras. He grew a goatee to look more like a villain. When his defense lawyers tried to suggest he was troubled, he undercut them by writing letters to the press from prison, bragging about his crimes. He wrote, "I liked it. It was not a mistake." He fully embraced the persona of the psychopath. He wanted to be the scariest man in New Hampshire. Christopher Gribble took a different route. He tried to intellectualize his evil. He took the stand in his own defense, a rare and risky move. He spoke in a flat, monotone voice, wearing a sweater and glasses, looking like a college student. He explained to the jury that he had flicked a switch in his brain. He tried to argue the insanity defense, claiming that because he couldn't feel emotion, he wasn't responsible. He described the murder of Kimberly Cates as if he were describing a math problem he had solved. He admitted to stabbing Jamie Cates, saying he aimed for her vital organs because it was efficient. His coldness was perhaps even more terrifying than Spader's mania. He asked the jury to find him not guilty by reason of insanity so he could be fixed and released. The jury was not swayed by Spader's theatrics or Gribble's pseudoscience. They saw them for what they were, thrill killers who had destroyed a family for fun. In November 2010, Stephen Spader was convicted of first-degree murder and attempted murder. He was sentenced to life in prison plus 76 years, without the possibility of parole. In March 2011, Christopher Gribble was also found guilty. The jury rejected his insanity plea in less than 2 hours. He, too, was sentenced to life without parole. William Marks and Quinn Glover, who had stood watch and not physically participated in the hacking, pleaded guilty to lesser charges of burglary and accomplice to murder. They received significant prison sentences, up to 40 years, and testified against Spader and Gribble. The story has a lingering legal tale. Because Spader and Gribble were minors, 17, at the time of the crime, Gribble was actually just weeks away from turning 18, but legally treated as a juvenile in some contexts of sentencing debates later. They were subject to the U.S. Supreme Court ruling Miller v. Alabama, which declared mandatory life sentences for juveniles unconstitutional. This meant they were entitled to resentencing hearings years later. In these hearings, Spader shocked the court again. He waived his right to a hearing. He told his lawyers, "I don't want to get out. I am a dangerous person." He accepted his life sentence, perhaps the only honest thing he ever did. Gribble, however, fought for a chance at parole. He argued he had changed. But the judge looked at the crime, looked at the machine, who had stabbed a child, and upheld the life sentence. He will die in prison. The Mont Vernon thrill killing stand as number 4 because of the sheer senselessness of the violence. There was no feud, no debt, no passion. It was a roll of the dice. It proved that in the digital age, a group of bored teenagers can detach from reality so completely that hacking a mother to death becomes a recreational activity. But the enduring image of this case is not the machete. It is Jamie Cates. The girl who played dead. The girl who crawled through the dark. She recovered. She returned to school. She graduated. She is the living testament to the fact that while evil is real, the human will to survive is stronger. She defeated the disciples of destruction simply by refusing to die. Number 5, Seth Mazzaglia. If the previous cases taught us about the dangers of strangers or the brutality of home invaders, the case of Seth Mazzaglia teaches us a far more insidious lesson, the danger of the wolf in sheep's clothing, posing as a friend. We travel now to Dover, New Hampshire, a bustling riverside town just minutes away from the campus of the University of New Hampshire. It is a town filled with students, young professionals, and a vibrant nightlife. But in October of 2012, inside a cluttered apartment on Pierce Island Road, a tragedy unfolded that would expose the darkest corners of manipulation and sexual violence. This is the story of the murder of Lizzi Marriott, a 19-year-old marine biology student whose bright future was extinguished by a man who treated human beings as props in his own twisted fantasy. Seth Mazzaglia stands as number 5 on our list because his crime was not just a murder, it was a total erasure. To this day, despite massive searches and a conviction, Lizzi Marriott's body has never been found, leaving a permanent void in the heart of the state. To understand the victim is to understand the magnitude of the loss. Elizabeth Lizzi Marriott was the kind of young woman who represented the best of New Hampshire. She was a dedicated student at UNH, passionate about the ocean and marine life. She was a beauty queen, a Target employee, and a loyal friend known for her kindness and trusting nature. She lived with her aunt and uncle in Chester, commuting to school and work, building a life filled with promise. She had no enemies. She did not engage in risky behavior. She was, by all accounts, the girl next door. Her fatal mistake was simply trusting a coworker. Lizzi had befriended a young woman named Catherine "Cat" McDonough, who also worked at Target. Cat was 19, like Lizzi, but her life was vastly different. Cat was living under the complete psychological domination of her boyfriend, a 29-year-old struggling actor and martial arts enthusiast named Seth Mazzaglia. Seth Mazzaglia was a man who lived in a self-constructed reality. Unemployed and living off disability checks and Cat's income, he spent his days in their darkened apartment playing video games and immersing himself in a warped version of the BDSM, bondage, discipline, sadism, masochism, lifestyle. While BDSM is a consensual practice for many, for Mazzaglia, it was a cover for abuse. He wasn't a master, in the community sense, he was a narcissist who used the terminology of dominance to enslave his teenage girlfriend. He controlled Cat's movements, her finances, and her relationships. He had drafted a contract that gave him ownership of her. By the autumn of 2012, Mazzaglia had become bored with just controlling Cat. He wanted more. He pressured Cat to bring another girl into their relationship, a third, to participate in their sexual games. Cat, terrified of losing Seth and desperate to please him, set her sights on her friend Lizzi. She knew Lizzi was innocent and uninterested in their lifestyle, but she also knew Lizzi was kind and would likely say yes to a casual hangout. On the night of October 9, 2012, Lizzi Marriott drove her Mazda Tribute to the apartment in Dover. She believed she was going there to watch a movie or play video games with Cat and Seth. She had plans to attend a class the next morning. She told her family she would be home later. It was a Tuesday night. Once Lizzi was inside the apartment, the trap was sprung. The details of what happened over the next few hours come primarily from the later testimony of Cat McDonough, and they paint a picture of predatory escalation. Seth and Cat tried to initiate a sexual encounter. Lizzi, reportedly uncomfortable but trying to be polite, rejected the advances. She made it clear she wasn't interested. In a normal world, this would be the end of the evening. The guest would leave. But in Seth Mazzaglia's world, no was an insult to his authority. According to the testimony, when Lizzi tried to rebuff him, Mazzaglia snapped. He didn't just get angry, he became homicidal. He attacked Lizzi from behind. He used a rope, or perhaps his arm, to strangle her. The violence was intimate and prolonged. Lizzi fought for her life. She scratched him. She struggled. But Mazzaglia, a man trained in martial arts and significantly larger than the 19-year-old girl, overpowered her. He choked the life out of her right there on the floor of his living room, while his girlfriend Cat watched and did nothing to stop it. The silence that followed the murder was the beginning of the cover-up. Mazzaglia, realizing he had just killed a young woman with a loving family who would immediately look for her, went into crisis mode. But it was a cold, calculated crisis mode. He instructed Cat to help him clean the apartment. They scrubbed surfaces. They hid evidence. And then, they had to deal with the body. In a detail that creates a nightmare image for anyone who travels, they took Lizzi's lifeless body and folded it. They stuffed her into a large, black rolling suitcase. It was a tight fit. They zipped it up. Under the cover of darkness, Seth and Cat carried the suitcase out to Lizzi's own car. They drove to Pierce Island in Portsmouth, a scenic park surrounded by the swift, cold currents of the Piscataqua River. This river is known for its treacherous tides and deep channels that lead out to the open Atlantic Ocean. It is a place where things that go into the water often disappear forever. They dragged the suitcase to the water's edge. They threw it in. They watched it sink and drift away into the black current. Then, they drove Lizzi's car back to UNH, abandoning it in a parking lot to make it look like she had disappeared from campus. They walked home, constructing their alibi as they went. The next morning, Lizzi Marriott didn't show up for class. She didn't show up for work. Her phone went straight to voicemail. Her family knew immediately that something was wrong. This wasn't like her. They reported her missing. The search for Lizzi Marriott was massive. Missing posters with her smiling face were plastered on every telephone pole in Dover, Durham, and Portsmouth. Social media lit up with pleas for information. Students at UNH organized search parties, scouring the woods and the riverbanks. For days, Seth Mazzaglia and Kat McDonough sat in their apartment, watching the news. They acted normal. When police questioned them, because they were the last people to see Lizzi alive, they lied. They told detectives that Lizzi had come over, hung out for a while, and then left to visit another friend. They were calm. They were consistent. But cracks began to form. The police noticed inconsistencies in their timelines. They found surveillance footage of Lizzi's car being driven at times when she was supposedly already gone. And crucially, they focused on Kat. They sensed that the 19-year-old girl was the weak link. She seemed terrified, not just of the police, but of her boyfriend. The breakthrough came when police brought Kat in for intense interrogation. Separated from Seth's controlling influence, her resolve crumbled. She eventually confessed. She told them everything. She told them about the lure, the murder, the suitcase, and the river. She agreed to turn state's witness and testify against Seth in exchange for a plea deal. Based on her information, police divers spent weeks in the freezing waters of the Piscataqua River. They used sonar, cameras, and grid searches. They found rocks, trash, and debris, but they never found the suitcase. The currents had likely swept Lizzi out to the vastness of the Atlantic. The inability to recover her body was a devastating blow to the Marriott family, denying them a funeral and a final resting place. Seth Mazzaglia was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. His trial in 2014 was a spectacle of victim blaming and gaslighting. Mazzaglia took the stand in his own defense. He spun a fantastical tale. He claimed that Lizzi's death was a tragic accident during consensual rough sex. He claimed that Lizzi had wanted to be choked, and that he had simply gone too far. He tried to paint the innocent marine biology student as a secret thrill seeker. He claimed that Kat was the mastermind, the one who orchestrated the cover-up. But the jury didn't buy it. They saw through the 50 Shades of Grey defense. They saw a predator who had killed a girl because she said no. They saw the scratches on his face in booking photos as evidence of Lizzi's desperate fight for survival. They heard the chilling testimony of Kat McDonough, who detailed the master-slash-slave dynamic that ruled their lives. In June 2014, Seth Mazzaglia was found guilty of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Kat McDonough, for her role in the lure and the cover-up, pleaded guilty to hindering apprehension and conspiracy. She was sentenced to 1.5 to 3 years in prison. She was released on parole in 2016, a fact that caused outrage among those who felt she was equally culpable for Lizzi's death. The case of Seth Mazzaglia stands as number 5 because it struck at the heart of the university community. It shattered the sense of safety for thousands of students. It showed that danger doesn't always look like a monster, sometimes it looks like a friend inviting you over for a movie. It also sparked a difficult but necessary conversation about the difference between BDSM and abuse. The BDSM community in New Hampshire actually rallied to distance themselves from Mazzaglia, clarifying that safe, sane, and consensual are the pillars of their lifestyle, and that Mazzaglia was nothing more than a rapist and murderer hiding behind a mask of kink. But the most haunting legacy of this case is the empty grave. Lizzi Marriott is still out there, somewhere in the deep, cold Atlantic. Her family has held memorial services on the beach, tossing flowers into the waves, the only connection they have left to the daughter who went to visit a friend and never came home.